The writing market carried the conversation for a good 20 minutes before they exhausted the subject. "You married, son?" Big Mike asked. "Yes, sir. Her name is Amanda." He pulls out his wallet and showed Big Mike a picture of a pretty redhead standing next to him at the altar of a large traditional church. "3 months ago, we met in college and fell madly in love." Big Mike grinned. "So you're still honeymooning, then? Have you had your first fight yet?" Daniel frowned. "Yeah, just before I left. She didn't want me to leave her alone." "You settle everything?" "Mostly. She wasn't happy with the decision, but I think she sees that this is something I have to do to build our future." A burst of static cut through the country music that had been softly playing in the background. Big Mike turned up the radio. "This is where it starts." His customary scowl deepened as the thought of Amanda crossed his mind. He had not thought of her in years, had refused to think of her. The bitch! He shook his head and continued to march across the pavement. The last lights from the city of Clarendon were fading behind him. It was late, and the traffic in town had been thin. Nothing had been open, so he had not even stopped. There was still a slight slapping noise from his shoe, but overall it was holding together. For a while he watched his feet, concentrating on putting one step in front of the other, blocking his mind. It had worked for years. In the dark he lost track of time. The moon was now directly overhead, lighting his way. For a while he kept the memories from crowding his mind. Patsy Cline was singing in his ears through his headset. He locked onto the words of her song, doing everything in his power to think of nothing else. The first burst of static was tiny, a little imperfection of sound. The station segued into another song, something about not trusting a backwoods lawyer. When the station cut out completely, he turned the knob, finding another station. Daniel pulled a tape recorder from his pocket and set it on the dash. He eagerly began flipping through the stations. He locked onto another country station for a while, then a rock station, and finally a pop station. Then he could find nothing. He continuously hit the scan button, listening eagerly for anything unusual. In the driver's seat, Big Mike shook his head, amused by his enthusiasm. The minutes that passed were only broken by the static from the radio. It took somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes before the radio began picking up stations again. Daniel continued to flip the stations for another 10 minutes, then sat back inside. He had heard nothing. Still, he had the tape. Perhaps it had caught something he had not. Most of the stations had given out. A local rap and hip-hop station was the last one he had latched on to, and it was beginning to fade. He paused at the top of a rise. The music was strongest there. He considered turning around and going back. Memory Lane was not all it was cracked up to be. Turning around would throw them off his trail. He could go back to the junction with I-40 and follow I-40 instead of 287. Unless they were close on his heels. They might have taken 40 looking for him, or they were right behind him, and he would just walk right into their arms. No, it was better to keep walking. He didn't know what was ahead of him, but he did know what was behind him. He could not go back. He concentrated on his feet, one in front of the other, on the downward slope. By the time he topped the next rise, the hip-hop station had been lost. He would not pick up the station again. He was reaching into his pocket to turn off the radio when he thought he heard something. He stopped for a moment and cocked his head to the side, trying to catch the sound again. There was definitely something there, under the static. He continued walking, leaving the static running. A strange new thought was occurring to him. With the advent of public computers and libraries and email, he could write without a system of his own. He thought he had given up writing when he walked away, but maybe he could find a way to make it work after all. If he stopped and used public computers, just for a few hours at a time, they would not find him. He could store the story in email until it was finished. He would have to find someone who would pay cash up front. He could not have a bank account, but he was sure he could find a place. The static cut for a moment and he heard something, although he could not say what it was. Maybe he could start over. And what better way to start his career again than by resuming his old story? He was definitely hearing something this time. He could recap what he learned the first time, then add what he himself heard going through it a second time. He would not be able to use his own name, of course, but maybe he could make a new name. A harsh voice whispered suddenly in his ear, and he jumped. It had come and gone so suddenly that he had not been able to make out the words. Unexpected eagerness rose in his heart. If he kept going, he might be able to make out what the voice said. He could prove to all the assholes who had laughed at his supernatural articles that he was a good investigative writer after all. He smirked. He could show up Edgar Corrigan after all, although it would be a little posthumous. He had not thought of Edgar in years either, another buried memory. Edgar, a fellow writer, they had been in writing class together. Daniel had always tried to outscore him on projects, and never managed. After graduation, Edgar had been given an internship with a big magazine company. Daniel had gone to him with his article series, thinking his former classmate would give him a leg up. Instead, Edgar had laughed when reading the article, told him that he would need a lot of work before he was good enough for publication. In part, that was where his troubles had begun. No matter what direction he turned, Daniel had been unable to get ahead. Every publisher he sent his articles to returned them. He suspected that Edgar was behind it. He, after all, was part of the inner circle of the publishing world now. Meanwhile, the payments for both his and Amanda's student loans and his travel loan were piling up. The static was burst by a bubble of noise, a harsh, discordant set of sounds that made no sense. The static resumed, then was broken by a whisper. The voice was soft, feminine. Only the wicked. Only the wicked? Finally, he had heard something useful for an article. He wondered what it meant. Only the wicked what? Was there more to hear? He topped another rise in the terrain. The voices faded away and the static resumed until he hit the downslope. The voices were jumbled. A woman's voice, a man's, a word here or there. A deep, discordant laugh. Nothing was coherent. Only the wicked, the woman's voice whispered again. How confusing. He began to hear her voice as an undertone sound in all the others. The more he listened to her voice, even when he could not tell what she was saying, the more captivated with the sound he became. He walked faster, working his way deeper into the radio phenomena. An image began to stir in his mind. The woman was pale, delicate, and lovely. She was clad in white flowing garments, and her blonde hair floated in the wind, ghostly, translucent at the edges. Hardly the frightening phenomena that those he had interviewed originally had described. He wondered how he would describe this conjecture when he put the tale to paper. How could he describe the certainty with which he could see her in his mind?